In today's episode, we jump into the action in April 1945 as Soviet forces race towards Berlin and close the ring around the Nazi capital.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again, another week, another podcast. We are returning, as I've just said, to the Eastern Front. You might say what remains of the Eastern Front in April 1945. The epic battle, the epic struggle that is the fight for Berlin. So we've already done a number of episodes on this, the build-up. I think originally we said we're going to do 1 or 2 or 3 episodes to cover all of Berlin. We are now, I don't know which episode this is. We haven't even reached Berlin yet because, as we all know, there are so many tensions that deserve our attention. But today, hopefully, we're going to get to the gates of Berlin in April 1945. So, Jesse, where are we at? What have we done so far? What have we seen so far? What is the situation? Where do we need to start from?
Right. Well, we are in the middle of what the Soviets call the Berlin operation. So when we think of the Battle of Berlin, often you think of the city, obviously, because that's the natural thing to do. But the military operation that's a part of capturing the city and the famous fighting that happens in the city is much broader. And that's what we've been going through in the last couple of episodes and trying to dive into and explain and understand and highlight and tangentify and whatever else we do here. So we've reached the stage now where everybody has prepared. The first phase of the battle is over. This phase is basically the Soviets breaking the initial German defensive lines east of Berlin and southeast of Berlin. Most famously at a place called Zelo, the Zelo Heights, this ridge about 60 kilometers east. So that position has been broken by the Soviets in about 4 days. So the operation starts April 16th. By April 20th, that position is gone. The Soviets are well on their way towards Berlin. So both Soviet army groups are involved in this. Zhukov's first Belarusian front and Konev's first Ukrainian front in the southern part. Once they break that initial line, they're off and running. There's a lot of fighting, but there's a lot of movement. First days were pretty sticky on the Zelo Heights, but by April 19th, 20th, you essentially have broken German forces streaming back, some towards Berlin, some in other directions, and the Soviet army groups coming in mostly from the east and the south, Konev in the south, right? So that's basically where we're at. And this phase, this breakthrough pursuit phase lasts until the city then gets surrounded some days later. So we're talking about a 5 or 6 day phase of the battle. And it's an interesting one because there's a lot of stuff happening. A lot of decisions get made. A lot of events happen that sort of will then set the stage for the fighting and what happens in Hitler's bunker and all that sort of thing. So I think more or less that's the situation that we've gotten ourselves up to in the previous episodes. Where do we want to start, Matthias, with these Soviet spearheads shooting across the countryside of the province of Brandenburg, mostly towards Berlin?
Well, as you said, there's a lot of stuff happening. Many things are going on, so you can take it anywhere. But maybe we go from, I don't know, let's start in the center, then we go north, and then we have a look at the famous episode, the famous battle that happens in the south as well. So just a little spoiler. So that, of course, is the Battle of Halbe and the pocket of Halbe. We'll get to that in much more detail. So maybe let's start in the center, because as you already said, and as we explained in the last episode or episodes, the focal point of the fighting is the Zelo Heights. We explained all the other reasons why. And it's there where the Soviets then, of course, break through on the 19th of April, as you've just mentioned. And then you've got this direct line that leads you all the way from the Zelo Heights straight to Berlin, along this very, very famous road, which in those days was called the Reichsstraße, so Imperial Road number 1. Today it's the B1, the Federal Road number 1. So you can see there's the change in the political system in Germany, embodied in the street names that you still can see today. And the Soviets know, the Germans know, once you're on the Seelow Heights, you've got this relatively open terrain in this area in front of you. It's a bit more difficult, particularly when you get to the south, but we will get to this. And as you already said, it's basically a rush. It's the race towards Berlin. And when you look at the Battle of Berlin, and we've all done lots of staff rides, military staff rides, battlefield tours going to Berlin. It is interesting because most groups know a little bit about the Seelow Heights and, of course, the fighting for Berlin itself. Everything between is not very well known, is not very much looked at, and there are a number of reasons for that. And probably the main reason is that whereas you have these defensive lines outside Berlin, the Seelow Heights, that's where all the massive fighting happens, easy to see stuff. And then, of course, got Berlin, we've got the same thing. In the middle, it's basically just that the Germans are running away. There are some actions that still take place. As you said, the Germans have one more defensive line in the area of Müncheberg. It's a relatively small place to the west of Seelow, mainly known because there's also the Müncheberg division that fights at the Seelow Heights. So that's where the name comes from. And there are a number of minor actions being forced. The Germans trying to fight delaying actions, but basically quite often it means just that the Soviets, they run into German troops as they're withdrawing. The Germans turn around and fight a desperate battle against the Soviets. One extremely famous example that is written about as well, and you can still see the terrain. It's really, really interesting when you go there. Happens at a place called Jansfelde, which is more or less halfway between Berlin and the Seelow Heights. I can give you the small little tactical example if you want, just to give you an idea. So you have a German anti-aircraft unit, flak unit, which is withdrawing from the front line. Strangely enough, it's moving north to south at that particular stage, which you might say really does not make all that much sense because it should be going further to the west. There are different arguments and explanations for this. One of them is that the main road was blocked, so they're firing a different route. And this flak battalion is withdrawing, and they basically get run over or ambushed, you might say, by Soviet tanks that are rolling up this main road, the Reichsstraße 1, Reichsstraße 1, and spot this German anti-aircraft battalion. The Germans spot them as well. They swing their guns round, the famous 88mm gun. They start engaging the Soviet tanks. There's a big you might actually say battle, perhaps even, that ensues. In the end, the Soviet tanks managed to outmaneuver the Germans. They only got a number of guns left. They managed to knock out quite a few, but in the end, the Soviet tanks managed to swing round, get into the flank of the German guns, and basically run over them and destroy them all. So you have several hundred German casualties in this engagement. The Germans also claim that they've knocked out about 100 Soviet tanks in this particular engagement. If you just look at these numbers, I mean, they're absolutely huge. If this is something that happened today, you lose 100 tanks. This is most Western armies gone. And in 1945, unless you are, as we all are, of course, the real spotter and the real history nerd, no one knows about this. You go to Jansfelde, there is nothing. There is not a sign, there is no memorial. It's just not even talked about or remembered. So unless you know these things, it just completely, you might say, written out of history, forgotten about. So it's just one example. And you've got quite a few of these that are happening. And in the end, what it boils down to in this particular part of the front line is the German troops are just withdrawing as quickly as they can back into the capital, just trying to get away from the Soviets, which of course is completely futile. They probably know this as well, but it's kind of probably human reaction, get away from the fighting and the horror. And the Soviets pursuing them as quickly as possible. So it's not really proper fighting, lots of small isolated incidents.
Yeah, I was going to say there are all these small little ones. I was thinking as you were speaking of a few others that I remember reading about, things like Strausberg, Müncheberg I thought about as well. So these little engagements, it's fairly chaotic on the German side, it must be said. There are units that have been broken up. There are units that have lost touch with their superiors, so they're not really getting orders. The chain of command is partially broken down. This is the case as well for the well-known 56th Corps of the German army, which is going to end up playing a big role in the defense of the city, even though that wasn't originally planned. Its commander, Helmut Weidling, he's taken up in this chaos as well. He's a part of this retreat, and he ends up losing contact as well for a few days with the big shots in Berlin and in the army bunker at Zossen or near Zossen, which we'll talk about, I suppose, when we get to the southern part. And so it gives a bit of an idea of the state of mind of the German high command, political and military, because they assume that he's just, what's a polite word for it, a turned tail, right? So, this phase of the war is not known for the German leadership sort of taking a sober second thought before making a decision, right? I think the famous historian David Glantz, I think he said it was more or less like a chicken with its spinal cord severed at this phase, from this phase of the battle, that it's just sort of thrashing around on instinct. In any case, they determined that Weidling has probably then, has betrayed his duty or what have you, and sentenced him to death. Then a couple days later, he gets in contact again, right? Because whatever, radio or I don't know, some made it to a telephone line in the midst of the retreat. Then he's not sentenced to death anymore. Now he's going to be the one who ends up in charge of defending the entire city, which also wasn't part of the original plan. So he goes from being sentenced to death to being on the cusp, and I suppose I'm giving a bit away here in advance, being on the cusp of commanding the entire defense of the city within a few days, just based on the chaos. So that gives you an impression. Another impression I have of this phase is a short account that I read from a Soviet maintenance unit. These are some other unsung heroes of military history, I guess you could say, the maintenance and logistics people. Because if you imagine like this engagement you mentioned at Jansfeld, where you have heavy Soviet tank losses, maybe not as heavy as the Germans reported, because they also reported something like 200 tanks destroyed at Strausberg and so on. So, but heavy nonetheless. And this guy had been in this maintenance group who was writing this account, and he basically said, we worked like almost nonstop. I barely slept for days and days because we kept getting these broken down or damaged but salvageable vehicles, and we would just set up our workshop wherever we could in abandoned schools or gymnasiums or whatever, get the vehicle in, guys working at night, guys working without the proper equipment, without sleep, just to get these things back out there and going. So the Red Army is an effective machine, but it's an absolutely brutal machine to be a part of, just squeezing the life out of every human or the energy out of every person who's a part of this big organization to just keep that monster kind of turning and churning and heading towards Berlin. His unit was repairing self-propelled guns, really big self-propelled guns, the Su-152s, so a big 152 millimeter gun in it, nicknamed the Beast in Russian, Tvar. And in any case, that stuck with me because you don't see that. You don't really come across those types of maintenance crew accounts that often. Usually it's combat, of course. But so that's the stress and the chaos of trying to keep up with this advance in the Soviet sort of rear areas is an interesting one as well.
Absolutely, and maybe just a general point, and here's the first slight tangent of the day. It's the whole thing about maintenance, about the non-teeth arms. As you said, quite often we don't even look at these because, what is the right term? It's not the sexy stuff, is it? If you're interested in military history, what you want is the battles, you want the explosions, you want the bigs and the bangs. But actually, you don't get the big bangs unless you have all that stuff behind. And all armies, even the Soviet army and even the German army in 1945, they are very, very reliant on, of course, what goes on behind the front line in the hinterland. Probably these two armies are much leaner and much tighter in their structure than the Western allies, who are very much relying on resupply, on logistics, which makes them to a degree a bit slow. But in the end, also successful because they've got firepower, they've got logistical resupply, whereas the Germans in particular don't really have that. But it is absolutely fascinating because we don't look at this. And without these guys, things would never happen. So I think we talked about the merchant navy once and said, well, the merchant navy guys, well, they are like the unsung heroes of World War II because they do all these very, very nasty runs all the way to Murmansk and other places. And generally speaking, with a broad brush, well, quite often these rear area troops and units fit the same category because no one ever talks about them because it's just not sexy, is it? You want the daring and dashing tank commander rather than someone who fixes the tank with a spanner. So that's what you get. So, but there we are.
A wrench for our American viewers, by the way, is a spanner. Just to bridge the gap.
Do you know what
there.
the Germans call? I can give you another one, which I find quite interesting, which tells a lot about cultural views as well. So in German, the spanner or wrench is called an Englishman. And the idea behind that is, because it's suggestible, isn't it? So that's the whole idea. You've got a adjustable spanner, that's what you call the Englishman. And in the German way, you're very proud, of course, of the engineering skills and look down on every other nation in the world. Whether that's still justified or not is a different matter. Let's not go there. That's a different topic. But the argument is it's called an Englishman because it always does the trick. It kind of works, but never properly. So there we are. That's the cultural hit for you.
Yeah, that's funny because in French, a particular type of wrench, which at least in Canadian English we would call a monkey wrench, is called an English wrench, une clé anglaise. But anyway, we're becoming a language podcast here for the moment. This is a new tangent. I like it. I like language stuff too. Anyway, to bring us back to the situation around Berlin, you have these forces racing towards the city. They're not only racing towards it from the east, where Zhukov's army group is moving, they reach the edges of the city by like April 20th, 21st. Essentially, they're starting to get into the suburbs. They can start shelling, I think from April 21st, they can start shelling any part of the city more or less, which is a new phase then because you have artillery shelling that can reach anywhere within the city itself. April 20th is, of course, Hitler's birthday. And I guess the birthday present was some 152 millimeter artillery shells crashing down on the city. Hey everybody, we just wanted to quickly jump in here and let you know about an awesome project that we have coming up that you can participate in. In September 2026, Matthias and I are going to be giving a battlefield tour in Berlin, looking at the fighting that took place there at the end of the Second World War in 1945. And of course, we're excited. We think it's going to be awesome, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. So Matthias, why don't you give us a little sneak peek? What are we going to do?
Well, as you said, Jesse, it's going to be absolutely brilliant. It's going to be fascinating, analyzing the battle, the sheer destruction, the fighting in the center of Berlin. We're going to be visiting all the key locations that you need to see, that you need to understand if you want to understand the fighting in Berlin in 1945, which of course also has implications for European politics then after 1945 all the way up to today. So, for example, we're going to be visiting and discussing the Soviet attack onto the Reichstag, starting at the Moltke Bridge, where the Soviets crossed the River Spree and then attack the Reichstag itself. We're going to see the Führer bunker, where Hitler was sitting and hiding and still dreaming of world domination until he decided to kill himself. We show you exactly the spot where he then was burned, and the Soviets found the remains after the battle. We're going to be looking at the Bendler Block, which was part of the German High Command. This is where Stauffenberg had his office. That's where they tried to overthrow the Nazis and Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944, where he and other people were then shot that particular night, where you now have a museum dedicated to German resistance. We're going to be looking at the topography of terror, which was the headquarters of the Gestapo. The remains, the foundations are still there. There's an exhibition. And we're also going to go to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp in the north of Berlin, to explore this particular nasty side of the Nazi regime as well. So it's going to be a full few days. It's super nerdy. It is for the real history enthusiasts, so like us and hopefully you, and we'll hope to see you all there.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Once again, the battlefield tour of Berlin is going to be September 9th to 13th, 2026. If you're interested in finding out more, go to battleguide.co.uk and hopefully we'll see you there.
So when we look at the first Belarusian front that you already mentioned earlier, so this is, of course, the army front under Zhukov. That's the one that attacks the northern, you might say, northern part of Berlin. And we've talked about this a number of times. Now to the south, of course, we've got the first Ukrainian under Konyev. We also talked about what this really means. Does that mean they're full of Ukrainians and Belarusians? No, they're not, because this is the geographical designation of when these army groups, or fronts, as the Soviets would call them, were formed. So in the north, you also have this pincer going around Berlin because, as we all know, the idea is not to only attack from the east and drive the Germans into Berlin and squeeze them out like some sort of toothpaste tube, but actually encircle them as well. So you've got them in the back. And of course, also that means, I think we talked about this as well in a previous episode, it also means you've encircled Berlin, the Western Allies can't get there. So that's an extra bonus, so to speak. So you have parts of the first Belarusian front is attacking to the north of Berlin. It's to the northern pincer to go around. And the idea is that to the west of Potsdam, these two pincers are supposed to meet. And so you have, in particular, you've got, so first Belarusian front, you've got the second Guards Tank Army, which again is the reserve, you might say, which as they push along is then sent into the northern suburbs of Berlin. And you've got another kind of sub-pincer, you might say, that goes straight to the west. And that, amongst other troops, is the Polish First Army. So again, reformed to a large degree after the Soviets would have called it the liberation of Poland. Probably our views are slightly different on this, but reconstituted. And you've got these Poles fighting now, and they keep pushing. And that's also a very interesting one because they also get into the area of Oranienburg. Oranienburg is to the north of Berlin. Oranienburg in those days is famous for two or three things. So the first thing is that this is the seat, the center of the German uranium and atom bomb program, which of course is very, very slow. This whole thing gets bombed by the Allies. So even today, you've got more radiation in Oranienburg than anywhere else in Germany. So should you ever go there, well, be prepared, take a suit. It's not that bad. It's not that bad.
I've been there and lived to tell the tale.
I've been there many times. That's why I've got a second head. There we go. Yeah, there we are. The second thing why this is quite important, the area is important, which lots of people don't even talk about and think about anymore. This was also one of the center of the German military aircraft production, sort of bombers. There's huge plants and factories in this area. They've all disappeared. They've all been turned into other things, so they don't exist anymore. But that was that. And of course, the most famous bit of the whole Oranienburg thing, it is, of course, a place of a very famous concentration camp, which gets liberated by the Soviet forces. And what they also do, of course, is that they then incorporate a number of these people who are still able to walk, still look reasonably fit. They're basically just incorporated back into the Soviet army to just boost the numbers because they have suffered quite some casualties as well. And Sachsenhausen, that's the name of the concentration camp, is of course one of the very famous ones because it was one of the early ones as well. It's not an extermination camp because they're all in the east, but still lots of people die. In particular, also Soviet prisoners of war who are brought there and basically just shot and killed. So it's nasty stuff. We haven't really touched on concentration camps and extermination camps. We probably need to do another series on that, but suffice to say, probably for this particular episode, that there is this very, very big concentration camp, which then gets liberated as well. I mean, got lots of stories, and I did some research on this. So there are some harrowing stories from Sachsenhausen, even though in inverted commas, it's not an extermination camp, but only a concentration camp. But you know what I mean by this. So, and even in this area, the German defense and resistance crumbles quite quickly. So that, again, you've got a little bit like in the other areas, you've got some small pockets where the Germans are still trying to put up a resistance. It's not really working anymore because the Soviets have broken through. The German army also in the north is pretty much broken. You've got these little pockets. They're trying to get away. The problem is, where do you go? So if you're clever, if you're not completely stupid, you're trying to get to the west as quickly as possible to link up with the Allies, to surrender to the Western Allies. rather than to the Soviets get captured by them. And that's basically, you might say, it becomes a bit of a race to the border or the front line and the boundary between the Soviet force, what becomes the boundary between the Soviet forces and the Western Allies. So the fighting there also then more or less collapses, and the Soviets keep pushing through. And once they've gone past Berlin, they swing to the southwest to make sure that in the area of Ketzin, so that's to the west of Potsdam, to kind of northwest of Potsdam, this is where they're supposed to meet the other pincer, which is coming in from the south. What have I forgotten? I was quite broad brush. What have I forgotten?
I think a broad brush is the only way to treat this kind of phase of an operation like this, because it is so chaotic, the fighting is so sporadic, the distances being covered are fairly large. I mean, at Zelo, the fighting is inching forward day by day. And here, as fast as the tanks can drive, some of them, that's how far they go for that particular day. I mean, Sachsenhausen is significant. As you mentioned, it's one of the earlier concentration camps that starts in the 1930s. If memory serves, something like 200,000 people were killed there over the course of its entire existence. And most of the prisoners there are not there when the Red Army arrives, because they've been driven out in one of these infamous death marches, in theory towards the Baltic Sea, to drown them there, but in the end, they don't manage to get them there. So that's an important one, I think.
And of course, we don't want to turn this into a specific episode on Sachsenhausen and, as I said, concentration camps. We need to do our due diligence and then have a very in-depth discussion on this, because otherwise it's just all right to do it. But what is also interesting, just if you look at the relationship and what happens after the battle is over. So after the battle is over, the Soviets, of course, keep this camp running, and it becomes one of their special camps, in which they, in turn, are also enemies of the state. And again, a number of people are killed there, and they keep this camp running for a number of years. One of the most famous victims of the person who dies there is Heinrich George, who was the father of Götz George, both very famous actors. And Heinrich George was one of the most famous German actors in the 1930s, in the 20s and 30s. And he is interned this camp as well. And then he dies, some people say, because of malnourishment or whatever happened to him. But you can see it's interesting how the history, what do you want to call it? It's not the tradition, but this lineage continues, and you just change the regime and change the sign on the door, so to speak, and the camp just keeps running.
Yeah, Sachsenhausen towards the end took on a bit of a different character from the, I also hesitate to use the word, but let's say traditional political concentration camp, because they ended up transporting Jewish prisoners towards the west and temporarily putting them in there. It was overcrowded. So in the end, even the sort of character of Sachsenhausen started to change and be more connected to the Holocaust proper, let's say, directed against Eastern Europeans and Jews. However, before we move on from this tangent, I don't want to flog it to death, but there's another concentration camp that's liberated, or another larger one that's liberated during the Berlin operation. It's on the 30th of April, so maybe skipping ahead inside our tangent here. And that's a bit farther north, so it's liberated by this second Belarusian front in the north, so the less important for Berlin army group, and it's Ravensbrück, which is notable because it's an all-women's camp. So you have all sorts of female political prisoners there. And again, they were also driven out on a death march before the Soviets arrived, and there's only a much smaller number of people who are then liberated by the Soviets. Some very interesting accounts of when the Soviets arrived. They're on horseback. It's like a scouting group. And the women in the camp start celebrating because, of course, even though they might be worried about what these new guys with weapons are going to do, they're hopeful it's not going to be as bad as what they'd had before. In any case, there's a very interesting account, I forget the name now, by an Italian. I think it's Flöck, her last name Kalita, maybe. Anyway, she wrote a very interesting account of her time at Ravensbrück as a leftist political prisoner of the Nazis. To close that off, or do you want to add a thought about that? Okay, the tangent continues, people. Here we go.
The tangent continues, but again, I keep saying just a very short one. As we all know, it's never going to be short. Just returning very briefly back to Sachsenhausen, what is really interesting is when you walk around there today, and first of all, you see, of course, the camp. You see where, for example, the Soviet prisoners of war were shot after they'd been marched through the town of Oranienburg. So you can see all this. But what I also find very interesting, if you move outside of the camp for a brief moment, Sachsenhausen was also the seat of the concentration camp machinery, you might say. That's where the headquarters is, the SS headquarters for everything to do with concentration camps. And the fascinating thing is how small this is. So you look at the headquarter building, and it's basically, well, today that would be a battalion headquarters. That is it. And from there, you organize, well, all of these concentration camps, and in the end, also the extermination camps. And that is really interesting in itself, I find, when you look at how small, how lean this organization was at that particular stage when they set this up, and becomes also the training institution. So everyone who's supposed to do something within a concentration camp, particularly high echelons, would go there for a while to get trained, and then, of course, be sent out. So it's just the size and the scale is interesting because it is so small when you think about all the pain, the suffering, the death that all these things brought, and how small that area is. So you can still walk around in some of these former official houses. Say when you got posted there, you got a house, and they look very much kind of Nazi in the 1930s style. They're still all there today, so they're now normal houses. People live there. The headquarters building is there. It was a self-contained little settlement. And when you walk around, you get a good feel for it. And just how small it is, I always find it completely mind-boggling. But now I think we need to close this tangent, because otherwise we're turning this into an episode on concentration, extermination camps. I say we probably need we need a bit more depth than that. So it's otherwise we don't do the whole thing justice.
Absolutely. It is interesting. That whole system is very interesting. We'll talk about it more at some future point on the podcast. That is something you'll come across in many accounts of the Battle of Berlin, is all the tiny little forced labor camps that were spread all across the country. Essentially, there are multiple small little forced labor camps in small towns, in different parts of Berlin. They're all over the place. And there's constantly accounts of them being liberated when the Soviets reach that village or reach that neighborhood or what have you. So, where are we now after our tangent? We are getting close to the encirclement of Berlin. So you have Zhukov's group coming from the east, and then eventually, as you say, from the north as well, trying to get around the city. And then we have Konyev's group coming from the south. Now, they have a couple of different things they're trying to do. Their job is to protect Zhukov's southern flank. Their job is to also strike east towards Dresden. And it is to come up from the south, past Potsdam, to meet up with Zhukov's guys coming from the north, somewhere to the west of Berlin. It turns out that happens on the 25th of April, near a small town called Nauen, which I once biked to from Berlin. There's not a lot to see there, but I wanted to go and see what it was like. So I had my day of biking about 80 or 90 kilometers there and back from Berlin. If you're interested in biking to Nauen. In any case,
it's very easy. It's very flat, so it doesn't
absolutely
count.
Yeah. As Konyev moves up from the south, there are a couple of interesting things that take place. The fighting there is more or less similar. There are these sporadic things. They capture a couple of interesting places, including a town called Zossen, which is just to the south of Berlin. And near there's a bunker, big command bunker at a place called Wünsdorf, which had a barracks and training grounds and all the rest of it. And that's really was let's say the brain of the German army. That's where the headquarters had been throughout much of the war. That's where, for example, ironically, Operation Barbarossa was planned in late 1940. It's interesting. You can go and visit it now. There's also some above ground concrete constructions that are half in ruins. And so it's a little bit symbolic that this is the sort of the nerve center, the former nerve center of the German military that is now being captured. There are some apocryphal stories, potentially apocryphal, of, the last message to come out from a German radio man being like, Ivan is at the door, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's kind of a symbolic ending of the real organization, I guess you could say, of the German military, as a part of that push from the south.
The entire Zossen area is absolutely fascinating, as you said, even today. Zossen, which is about 20 kilometers to the southeast of Berlin. It's becoming popular now because we've now got a very good rail line into Berlin. It's still affordable, so lots of people are moving there at the moment. But you can still see that it has a very military feel to it, because this was one of the centers of what some people would call Prussian and German militarism. You already talked about the Zossen complex. So it's Maybach 1 and Maybach 2, they are called. Named after the car, a very famous fancy car in the 1930s, the Maybach, basically the Rolls-Royce of the 1930s. And the idea was that if you build this area there and you call it Maybach, everyone will think, well, that's a new plant for cars, whatever. Bit silly, but there we are. Maybach 1, so as you said, you've got these buildings, they still exist today, concrete buildings. They look like normal houses, to disguise it from the top. Very big concrete walls. They've got a tunnel, a ring road going round. And Maybach 1 was the seat of the Army High Command, the OKH. And you've got, not far away from there, you've got Maybach 2, which is the seat of the OKW. And it's mainly the army that goes there, as you already say, and sit there. And it's quite eerie when you go there, because you can do these guided tours. You already mentioned it. You see these bunkers, which they tried to blow up after the Second World War, but it didn't really work. They're still there. Some of them are falling apart now a little bit. But as you said, you can see we know exactly which bunker Operation Barbarossa was planned by Friedrich Paulus. So these things are quite eerie. You can see all this. And they tried to disguise all sorts of other things. So there was a house that they built. So when you want to get into the bunker complex, the big bunker complex that they have there as well, you already mentioned as well, they built a normal house on top. And on the one half of the house, you had a normal family living there. So to disguise the fact that actually this is the entrance to a big bunker, which in those days was actually the largest communications bunker installation in the world. That's the so-called Zeppelin bunker, because this was the communication center for the army, so the OKH, and of course the OKH is responsible for the conduct of war on the Eastern Front. When the Soviets get there, the Germans run away, and the Soviets continue to use this all the way to the 1990s. Because not only do you have that bit there, but you've got lots of other things as well. In the area, for example, Wünsdorf itself, which is just right next to Zossen, that's the training area and the experimentation area for the German armed forces. This is where the Soviets managed to capture the Maus, this huge German tank, the biggest tank ever built, which they then take back to the tank museum close to Moscow. I've seen it. It is huge, that beast. It's just unbelievable. Also unbelievably stupid when you start to think about this. It's really, what a weird design. But so 2 prototypes built. One, I think, is blown up. One, the Soviets take back to Moscow. Just putting that on a train because it's so big. What a feat of engineering by the Soviets. And so it stands there. All sorts of other material gets explored, tested, trialed there. You also have to the west of it, a relatively big training area, and the artillery school at Jüterborg. So that's the center of the German gunners at that particular time, going all the way back to the imperial time. So you can see there's a lot of military, let's call it heritage in this world. And all this after the war, if we jump ahead a little bit, becomes part of what the Soviets call the Forbidden City. Because this is the main center of the Soviet forces in Germany. And they're up to, figures are a bit debated, but some in the region of 50,000 people who live there in these old German barracks and what have you. And they basically built a big wall around it, and no one's allowed in or allowed out unless you've got the right sort of pass. Doesn't appear on any maps. So it's the secret and forbidden city. Of course, everyone knows where it is. But it's fascinating to go there. You can now get this mix between German pre-First World War all the way to 1945 architecture and things, and then Soviet stuff thrown in, like murals or whatever they put up. It's a fascinating place and really, really interesting. And yeah, as you say, it also is in many ways the end of, or a very good symbol of the end of the German military, because this is the high command. And how does it actually fall? Well, basically, they just pack their bags and run away. There is no fighting. And when you look at the Soviet accounts, they are surprised. They don't even know what they're running into. They didn't know that the German High Command sits there and conducts the war on the Eastern Front from there. And so they get into these bunkers and they say, well, the machines were all still there, the typewriters, the radio equipment. The Germans had basically just packed their bags half an hour before the Soviets arrive, and they run away. And last point on that, this entire area, Zossen, is also famous because of a quote by Hitler. After the 20th of July plot, and of course he said, well, the army generals, that's the idea, well, tried to execute him. So these traditional guys who are more believing in the more kind of traditional view of the state, and perhaps even wanted the Kaiser back, and they were from the aristocracy. And so the embodiment of all of this, Hitler called the spirit of Zossen, because that's the seat of the Army High Command, the old traditional guys. He said, I need to make sure that the Geist of Zossen, the spirit of Zossen, is eradicated from within the army. So that became a very, very famous word. And Hitler himself, even though he wants to fight or fights this war in the East, doesn't go to Zossen. He never goes there for a meeting. I think he goes there once, if I'm not mistaken, once while it's built, but I might be wrong. But that is it. So he always makes sure that Zossen, the Army High Command, comes to him wherever he sits. He never goes there. So it's really interesting. The place is fascinating. The history, pre-1945, 45, also the relationship between military and political leadership and all these things. So you can see I'm getting quite excited about this because it is a fascinating place. I've been there so many times. It's really quite good.
Yeah, and there's still kind of abandoned old barracks and things like that in the woods, and it's quite an interesting place to be that makes you reflect on, you know, the grand course of history and all the sort of triumph and tragedy that's mixed in there. So I think to round off this pursuit phase where the Soviets are essentially getting to and around Berlin, there's a couple of final points I want to leave our listeners out there and viewers with. And they have to do with dates and pockets, let's say. So April 25th is an important date because that's when the Soviet pincers meet near the town of Nauen to the west of Berlin. So Berlin is surrounded from April 25th. The same day, much to the south, something like 150, 160 kilometers to the south, the Soviets meet up with the Americans on the Elbe River near a place called Torgau. Doesn't really have to do with the Battle of Berlin directly, but it's an interesting thing that's happening at the same exact time. And then there's another interesting meetup that happens on the 24th, so one day before, and that is to the southeast of Berlin a little bit. You have Zhukov's forces also meeting with Konev's forces there, and this creates, to the southeast of Berlin, so you have Berlin being surrounded, right, to the west in the big pincer movement. And let's say you have a small pincer movement that traps most of the German Ninth Army in a bunch of forests and swamps. There's also part of another army, I think it's the 4th Panzer Army. And this pocket, it kind of has its own little battle while the major operation for Berlin continues. And that's starting on the 24th of April. Usually in German and in English, it's called the Halbe pocket or the Battle of Halbe. Halbe is a village that's in the middle of this area that the Soviets have surrounded. The Soviets call this group of Germans the Frankfurt Guben group. So they have a different naming for it. And it's up to 200,000 Germans trapped in this pocket. Could be less, could be like 80,000. It's hard to say because the record keeping obviously is not good. It's chaos at this point. But you have a very, very large group of German forces trapped in this pocket. And the battle is a pretty bitter one, Matthias.
It is an absolutely, well, you might say, well, Turkish shoot is completely the wrong word, isn't it? It really sounds too easy, but it's slaughter. That's what it is. Well, in the German, it's in the word, isn't it? Schlacht in German basically means slaughter. So there, battle means slaughter, and this is really what you get. So when you look at the map, that's the operational map here. So you've got the Soviets breaking through in the north and in the center, so to the east of Berlin. They're also beginning to break out of the bridgeheads that they have across the river Oder further to the south, so in the Cottbus area. And this is also the pincer that then goes kind of up towards Berlin as well. And everybody looking at this map can see, you know what, you've got this German army standing there, the Ninth Army, between all these pincers to the southeast of Berlin, as you say, in this area of Halbe, Märkisch Buchholz. And everybody looks at this map and says, you know, we need to get these guys out, because if we leave them where they are, they're going to get encircled and annihilated. Hitler says, no, they need to stay where they are because they're fixing enemy troops. And also, of course, the famous episode, everyone who's seen Downfall, or the memes made out of this, where is Wenck, the famous counterattack by Wenck to the south of Berlin and from Potsdam onwards, which Hitler thought would just get everything back in order and would lead to the complete destruction of the Soviet forces. They were supposed to link up with the Ninth Army to the south of Berlin and then basically secure the entire flank. Everybody knows that this is not going to happen, and this is quite a stupid idea. And far too late, this army is then is given the green light to start withdrawing and make their way to the west. And what you then get is, because you have these Soviet forces kind of advancing along and spearheading, so they've encircled all these troops, an entire army, plus a relatively unknown number of civilians. You said about 200,000 in total. No one's really quite sure. As you said, it could be more, it could be less. And what you then end up with is what they call the wandering pocket, because you've got this pocket, and this entire pocket is trying to move to the west. And they're trying to break through the Soviet lines to link up with this army of Wenck to the south of Berlin in the Potsdam area. And what now happens is a complete tragedy, and it's probably one of the most awful episodes of World War II, because they get completely shot up. And how does all this happen? Well, the first thing is terrain and the topography. When you look at what goes on and how this terrain looks like, so it's relatively flat, but you also have lots of trees, and normally kind of fir trees and what have you, because that's just the sandy soil that supports this. So they're quite thick, quite dense, difficult to get through. You can't just drive through with the vehicle. And you've got a number of limited roads and paths that lead through these very deep, dark woods. I haven't used that word in quite a while, actually, so there we go. And as, of course, the Soviets are now further to the west, they know exactly where the Germans are coming from, because first of all, you've got a very limited number of these paths and roads, and also the Soviets have got now complete air superiority. So they know exactly where these German tracks go. And so they're just in front of the Germans, to the west of the Germans. They create a blocking position on this road, and the Germans have to then get to this position, attack the position, breach the position, and then continue until they hit the next one. And as they do, and as they continue, of course, they get weaker and weaker and weaker. There are numerous examples of German self-propelled guns and Tiger tanks going there and advancing. Famous stories, and their entire books have been written about this, how these Tiger battalions, kind of their strength dwindles, and every time they attack one of these things, they lose one, or basically they just simply run out of petrol. There's a lot of that going on. And so in the end, it becomes a Turkish shoot. You can see pictures. Well, if you just look online, just type in Battle of Halbe, you will see the complete destruction of these German forces that you get there, all these shot up vehicles. And that, of course, also means an awful lot of dead people, both civilian and military on the German side. It's an absolutely awful place.
Yes, it's unimaginable. I've read some harrowing accounts about the Halbe pocket. They make several attempts to try to break out through Soviet-controlled territory to get to Wenck's army farther to the west. They try it several days in a row. First, they fail, and finally, I think on the 28th of April, about 25,000 of that original potentially 200,000 make it. They temporarily kind of filter through the Soviet-held area there and make it to Wenck's army, where presumably they would then try to surrender to the Western Allies. There's a lack of food. There's a lack of water. There's a lack of medical care. There's a very readable account in English called Slaughter at Halbe by Tony Letizier, if anyone out there wants to dive into the topic a little bit more. But yeah, it's absolutely brutal. And they are still, once in a while, finding bodies in the forested areas around Halbe, and there's a cemetery there that has become quite famous and also quite controversial because quite a lot of the casualties from the Halbe pocket fighting are buried in this one cemetery. And unfortunately, it's been instrumentalized by some extremist political groups today who kind of say that, it's a shrine and want to go there for purposes that I would say are unfortunate. So there's an interesting legacy there, but I can tell, Matthias, that you want to add some context.
Yeah, I mean, I've been just like you many times, and it is a fascinating place. So you're looking at 28,000 people buried there. The vast majority from the episode we just described, both military and civilian. I think the youngest one, I can never remember exactly. I'm nearly dead, not even quite sure it's a boy or girl. I think 7 years old, dies on this trek trying to get out. You also have a couple of thousand people buried there who were then or died or were killed in the Soviet special camps after the war. So again, you can see how all this history comes together. Yeah, it was used particularly, I think, in the 90s by specific groups. I think in typical Germanic fashion, they've now completely thrown out the baby with the bathwater. So a couple of years ago, I think there was this idea to put candles up on all these graves, and they did that, a bit like what happens in the UK, for example, every year in many military cemeteries. And they were all officially removed because they thought, oh no, we can't have this. This is coming potentially from the wrong political spectrum. This is sending out completely the wrong message. So they were all removed, which I think is completely ridiculous. But as you also said, it's still a place where you go and remember, and it's also, generally speaking, not people from what you might call the wrong end of the political spectrum. But you also mentioned that they still find bodies. So on average, roughly speaking, they still find in there about 100 bodies a year. So you can see there's a lot of bodies still being found. Just think about the situation in 1945. So all these woods and forests are full of dead people, civilians, military people, completely burned out vehicles. It's a complete carnage, a scene from hell. And of course, they get these people into graves mainly because you're now getting into the summer of 1945 after the battle is over, and that's a health risk. And you just throw them into the graves, and that's it. But those who are a bit further into the forest, well, no one really deals with them because you've got other things to worry about. You need to get your life back on track. You don't go around searching for all these bodies. You then have a local priest there who starts all of this, gets these guys the bodies into the ground there in the cemetery. But I said, even today, you find about 100 bodies every year. And it was probably, I think, 2 years ago when I was in Halbe, and we went there, was with the British Army group. And it was one day before they had this big burial ceremony because they found all these bodies. And once a year, they then put them into the ground. It's a relatively big, but German standard ceremony. You've got the military there. You've got politicians there. And so I was walking around and you had all these volunteers from the army. And I said, okay, hi guys, what's going on here? What do you do? So, well, we're doing this and this and this. And here are all the bodies. And they took me into this room where you had these teeny tiny coffins because you don't need big coffins anymore. You just need them so that the thigh bone, that's the longest bone, can fit in there. And you had, some of them were still open. Most of them were closed. Some of them were open. And you had, I think, 104 of these in this very, very small room. And it was really weird because I've been to many military cemeteries. You see stuff on operations as well, but that really got me because 104 bodies, 80 years after the battle, still being found and then being put into the ground. That was quite something, I have to say. And that really made me, I don't know, think. And then unfortunately missed the ceremony because, well, we had to move on. Otherwise, would have gone the next day. But it was a very big event. So there's still a lot happening because it is such an awful experience. And there are lots of, as you said, there are lots of examples. The Tissier book is very good. He's written a lot on the Battle of Berlin and the surrounding areas, the battle on the Seelow Heights. So for English, the English-speaking audience, that would be my go-to author, to be perfectly honest. He's good. Of course, he lived in Berlin and he knows all these things. I mean, if you want, I've got one episode here. I think it's even on out on the internet in Wikipedia, this account, but I've got it from the German archives, from a Nachlass of the personal papers. And it's about a German officer who is in that particular area. And he's quite famous perhaps not, but he fights in a number of famous episodes. His name is Rudolf Sicenius. He becomes prominent because he's the commander of the 16th Panzer Division, which of course comes from our hometown of Münster. And that's interesting and important. But to the English-speaking audience, if you're a proper spotter, you might know that these guys fought at Salerno in 1944. The division had been destroyed at Stalingrad. So there's all sorts of stuff you can do there. But in 1945, the remnants of his division are in that pocket as well, and he is killed during the battle. So the divisional commander is killed, and after the war, one of his officers writes down what he saw and what happened and how this person died, and he sends this letter, I think, to Zecchinius' brother, if I'm not mistaken. And you can find it in the personal papers, and so I've got it here. So if I just read this out. So towards the evening of a Sunday, must have been the 29th of April, because that was the Sunday. I can no longer recall the exact date. General Zecchinius and General von Roden organized all the units in and around Halbe to a breakout attempt. Again, you can see we need to break out, we need to get away from them. After marching for about 2 hours, the spearhead was attacked by some Russian tanks, which fiercely resisted. So the Soviets know exactly where you are, they attack, they're trying to push you back and all that. In the midst of the fighting, General Zecchinius left his SPW, so that's the armored vehicle, and personally attacked the enemy with a Panzerfaust in the forest. I mean, that's quite unusual. So if this was a British episode, that would be, we have films about this. So you've got a general divisional commander going out, taking up his Panzerfaust to attack the enemy position. And we all get terribly excited about what happens at Arnhem, where you've got a brigadier leading a charge. Here you've got a divisional commander who takes up a Panzerfaust. He's then wounded in the stomach. He had, so Zecchinius guy had said a number of times before, if I ever get wounded, I will not survive the war. That's going to be the end for me. So he then basically, you might say, well, he decides to shoot himself, because what happens then is in the early hours of April the 30th, so a few hours after the attack, this letter then continues. We felt we were safe and proceeded north along the road south of Lake Teupitz, west of the Autobahn. It's also interesting because you've got one Autobahn, a motorway running through, which of course the Germans want to get to, because this is where you can move quickly. This is also where the Soviets are, and the Soviets use the infrastructure, of course, as well. Into the forest, suddenly we encountered tanks and anti-tank guns awaiting. We were caught in intense fire and had to jump out. And then they recall this whole episode. Your brother jumped into the right onto a forest clearing while I went left. More insane enemy fire. I was wounded again and rolled away. Suddenly I heard your brother calling my name. I crawled towards him. Still a few steps away, I saw him shoot himself in the head with a pistol. He had a serious stomach injury. I tried to recover some of his belongings, but intense fire resumed in that area. Then the Russians attacked and we had to retreat. Believe me, there was nothing more that could be done. I mean, that again also just shows you the ferocity of the fighting, this whole approach. Well, I'm getting wounded. Abdominal wound is a nasty one at that stage anyway, so you might die, but well, I'm not surviving the war, I'm going to shoot myself. And when you read a little bit around what is being told here, it tells you again a bit about the fighting. So you've got the Autobahn, you've got this terrain, you've got these barricades, you've got the Soviets counterattacking. It's an absolutely horrendous situation to be in. It's absolutely awful. And this is also why we now at Halbe have the cemetery, 28,000 bodies in there, which makes it the largest military cemetery on German soil. So there's that. And of course, what we mustn't forget, because we always concentrate on the Germans here, the 28,000 Germans, they all get slaughtered. And yes, the casualty figures are quite high on the German side. Of course, you still also have Soviet soldiers dying. I think quite often they get written out of the story of the Battle of Berlin, which it's unfair, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, they're all soldiers fighting and dying for whatever cause, whether it's good or bad. Most of them probably even they're fighting for a good cause. But quite often we tend to concentrate very much on the German side and write the Soviets out of history for a number of reasons that there are.
All right, so quite an interesting anecdote about General Zecchinius there. And I think maybe this is a good point to round off this episode. We've covered a ton of ground, but essentially we're up to the point now where the Soviets have surrounded Berlin on the 25th of April. The Halbe pocket has been crushed by the 30th of April. And for our next episode, then, I think we'll focus on the final sort of climactic part of the battle, where in the city itself, which I think is what many of us associate the Battle of Berlin with. Hopefully, these last several episodes have given you a broader understanding of the whole operation and how the fighting in the city came to be. But that's what we're going to dive into next time. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Of course, we'd be very happy if you wanted to support us in our work here and make episodes like this one possible. To do that, you can go to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. You can also get access to some exclusive content there that's not on any other platforms. That's in a place that we call the War Room. And you can get a free trial by using the code word Deep Dark Woods, if you would like. So, of course, we'd be happy to see you there in the War Room. We'd be happy if you decide to support the podcast. And we'll be happy to see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Both Soviet army groups are doing this. That is to say, Zhukov's front, the...
First Belarusian.
Thank you. I don't know why I kept wanting to say second Belarusian. I'm like, it's not that. Both Soviet army groups are involved in this, so that's Zhukov's... is it first or second?
First.
Thank you. I know it. It's just that I slept like 5 hours.
And of course, this is one of the nasty stories because that concentration camp. My God, cut. What's the name of the concentration camp? I've forgotten now. I want to say Buchenwald, but Sachsenhausen. That's the one. No, thank you.
You and I are
having
memory problems today, man.
It's age, isn't it? It's age.
Must be.